19 російських дронів
19 Russian drones entered Polish airspace on the night of September 9th to 10th, 2025. Russian propaganda claims that it wasn't us. At the same time, it does not admit to other cases when Russian drones or aircraft violate the airspace of other NATO countries. This is Black Sky. Stop fake. Let's begin.
Чорне небо, стоп фейк. Починаємо. А сьогодні зі мною мої колеги Ольга Semashko.
Today I am joined by my colleagues Olga Semashko from Vilnius, good morning, and Artur Zhak from Lviv. Olga has information about what is happening in the airspace over Lithuania.
Інформацію про те, що відбувається в повітряному просторі над Литвою.
Yes, indeed. Lithuanian airspace and the situation there are currently a hot topic because it is an extremely important issue for Lithuania, and there are news reports on this subject almost every day. It is happening right before our eyes. Then another piece of information appeared that Vilnius airport was closed today because an unmanned aerial vehicle was spotted there. Flights were suspended for several hours, both landings and takeoffs. What was this drone, and who did it belong to? It is still unknown. But I will say this, such news is no longer a rarity in Lithuania. It appears constantly, as does information about Russian drones that occasionally fly over the country's territory. Also this morning, there were reports that another group of Russian aircraft approached NATO airspace, and Hungarian fighter jets even took off from the Lithuanian base in Šiauliai to intercept these 5 Russian military aircraft. And, as reported, these fighter jets were very close to NATO airspace, not complying with international flight safety rules. All the information is consistent. The information is being collected and analyzed. I have been analyzing and, you could say, observing how the Russian side is reacting to all this, and in particular to this incident. So far, the Russian side has not reacted in any way.
Треба теж зауважити, коли ми
We should also take into account when we are recording our podcast. Today is September 26th, 2025. This is crucial for understanding when all these events are taking place and when they took place. Continuing what you said, Olga, about these repeated violations of the airspace of the Baltic countries, in particular Lithuania. It must be said that recently, over the past 2 or 3 days, we have also seen, we have witnessed drones. I suspect that these are primarily, almost 100%, Russian drones flying over airports in Denmark.
Наприклад, аеропорт Ольборг вже двічі був зачинений за останній час.
For example, the airport in Aalborg has already been closed twice recently due to unknown drones flying over it at night. I think this is mainly due to the fact that there is also a NATO base near Aalborg, which is common knowledge. So Russia is intensifying its activities here, probably looking for weak points in various alliance countries. Because unfortunately, the response of individual NATO countries to these flights by Russian drones and even combat aircraft is not uniform everywhere. Tell us, Artur, please remind us what happened a few days ago in Estonian airspace.
В повітряному просторі Естонії.
Yes, indeed, this is a multidimensional escalation on the part of Russia, as you mentioned, Dmytro, because when it comes to Romania or Poland, for example, these are drones sent from the territory of Russia or Belarus. Also, the drones that ended up in Danish territory were probably sent from the area bordering Denmark. For example, it is suspected that the warship that was in international waters was a Russian landing ship. Russian strategic aviation also approached the borders, both American near Alaska and Canadian. In addition, Russian bombers, such as the MiG-31K, which incidentally can carry Kinzhal missiles, remained over Estonian territory for 12 minutes and were in its airspace. This aircraft also flew over a Polish drilling platform in the Baltic Sea. Russian fighter jets flew over.
Також над нафтодобувною вежею польською на Балтійському морі.
This means that this is a multi-directional test of NATO, which is taking place deeper into the European Union, such as in Denmark, Norway, and Germany. Well, according to many experts, this is a lesson that the Russians have learned from the Ukrainian Operation Spider's Web. It should also be noted that there is a possibility of such harassment of European infrastructure using drones that will take off from civilian and military ships or from some containers or trucks. This must be kept in mind. And as Olga said, on the one hand, the Russians deny it, but on the other, they smile and say that Europe, which is directly involved in the war, should have expected this. On the one hand, they say it wasn't us. But on the other hand, I would remind you, for example, of a Bloomberg article published just yesterday, which states that high-ranking representatives and diplomats of the European Union met with the Russian side and declared that NATO would respond to any provocation. Well, according to Bloomberg, the Russians replied, "Why are you surprised? This is our response to the bombing and shelling of Crimea." Colleagues, we must take into account the fact that Ukraine has been shelling Crimea since 2022. This means that until then, they allegedly did not attack the territory of the European Union. So if we believe what Bloomberg writes, well, the Russians have directly admitted that they are at war with at least the countries of the European Union.
Принаймні з державами Євросоюзу.
І ще треба... Так, так.
I will add a few words here. Artur, when we talk about the violation of Estonian airspace, it was, as the Estonians themselves admitted, this is what happened there on September 19th, and it was already the fourth case of Russia violating Estonian airspace. But before that, so to speak, there was no such commotion, there was no such reaction. Now, however, Estonia reacted very quickly, very loudly, so to speak, because there was even talk of invoking Article 4 of NATO in connection with this situation.
Артикул НАТО у сувязі з гэтай сітуацыяй, але рэакцыя расіян якая была?
And what was the Russians' reaction? The reaction was as follows. We always fly this way. This is our regular route. We transferred our aircraft from Karelia to Kaliningrad, and nothing unusual happened. Well, if you are going to behave like this, then we are sorry. But we will also find cases where European aircraft have violated Russian airspace. So this is downplaying the incident. As for the second point, regarding the Bloomberg article, I have also read it, and it is very interesting. And Russia's reaction was interesting. As we know, in Russia, all such diplomatic activities are carried out by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which today, through its spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, commented on the article. She stated that no such meeting took place, that what Bloomberg writes about, I don't know what it is, what happened there, and said that this news, well, alleged news, fits very well with European anti-Russian propaganda and Russophobia. That is, Artur. While we all read Bloomberg and trust its sources, the Russian side claims that nothing like that took place.
It was a Schrödinger's meeting.
Так. Я хотів би теж тут нагадати про
I would also like to remind you of what the Russian ambassador to France, Alexei Meshkov, said literally yesterday, yes, on September 25th. On RTL, he stated that if NATO shot down a Russian plane, it would mean the beginning of an armed conflict. It would be war, Alexei Meshkov declared, and we immediately recall that it was NATO, specifically Turkey, that calmly shot down a Russian military aircraft at the time. And it did not cause any war. Well, except that Russia, it seems, banned the export and import of Turkish tomatoes for several months.
Імпорт турецьких помідорів.
And oranges.
Так.
Well, yes, the fact is that Meshkov's words and statements are currently widely circulated in the Russian media. And now, let's say, they are operating under the slogan, symmetrical response. Yes, that means that Russia is now ready to give a symmetrical response. If NATO decides to shoot down a Russian military aircraft in its airspace, the Russians are already prepared for this in terms of information.
Yes, and this is confirmed by both propagandists and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But in addition, it should also be taken into account that one of the things to note is Russia's actions. Because they can always say that, for example, the ambassador to France had no basis for making such statements. Russia has very often changed its mind, contrary to what is happening in reality, if we can call it reality at all. I mean, it's always this tactic, yes and no. Well, I would compare this narrative to Schrödinger's cat. In my opinion, this term fits very well with the narrative used by the Russian Federation. Of course, it advocates peace throughout the world, but with the help of nuclear weapons.
But listen, I want to talk about the narratives of Russian propagandists. Currently, they have become very cautious and are afraid to show any initiative in their statements, because we remember the story of when one of the Russian political scientists and propagandists, Sergei Markov, did just that. When he commented on Russian-Azerbaijani relations, he deviated slightly from the so-called party line, i.e. the Kremlin's narrative. He was immediately labeled a foreign agent, that is, inno agent, as the Russians themselves say. Therefore, anyone who comments on Russia's foreign or domestic policy now keeps this in mind. This is a lesson learned from the reaction to a commentator who did not exercise caution.
Ще є реакція ЄС.
There is also the EU's reaction. After all these aviation incidents involving Russia, the EU is also considering banning civilian aircraft from third countries from flying to Russia. And what the EU can really do is completely ban tourist visas for Russians. To be honest, I am very surprised that they are still receiving these these visas. Unfortunately, there is also opposition from countries such as Italy, France, and I believe Spain, where the number of wealthy Russian tourists is significant, and these tourists bring a certain amount of income to these European Union countries.
Певний прибуток цим країнам Європейського Союзу.
I would like to present the most classic narratives of Russian propaganda. The first one that comes to mind is the so-called denial or obfuscation. The Kremlin, for example, plays down the significance and in fact refers to the Ministry of Defense on this matter, on these events. We don't know anything. Please ask the Ministry of Defense. The second narrative is that it is a Ukrainian provocation. This information is disseminated in all media in Russia and also in the European Union. Another narrative is that it is an accident. Yes, several drones were sent there. Some may have flown into the territory or airspace of European countries, and the main tool, the method used by the Russian Federation, is the so-called whataboutism, or what about the West? This is what Olga was talking about. Okay, maybe they flew in, maybe they flew over, but you do it too, and much worse things. Well, if we are to believe what Bloomberg wrote, the world is actually portrayed in not very bright colors. If Russia directly admits that it is at war, not at the level of rhetoric or propaganda, but at the diplomatic level, then this is indeed dangerous.
Well, when we talk about Russian propaganda narratives, there is also Belarusian propaganda. And when the drones flew into Poland, it was a classic case of two propaganda machines unable to reach an agreement, failing to communicate, and sending out completely different messages. Because one was saying what Russian propaganda was saying. We already mentioned this today, that the drones flew in from Ukraine, got lost in that territory because the Ukrainian side deliberately interfered with them. And then Belarusian propaganda stepped in. The first thing they said was that there were indeed people in that building on Belarusian territory, but that we also shot down several machines and warned the Poles that the drones were flying in their direction. To be honest, I was curious to see how they would be able to reconcile their positions after hearing one side's account and then the others. But the development of this situation was never made public in our media, because on some closed channels and during secret meetings, they probably negotiated and discussed what to do. Well, since we're broadcasting, let's at least broadcast the same thing. But this never became public knowledge. Therefore, the question of whether the drones flew in from Belarus or not remains open.
I think that Russian propaganda in the person of Margarita Simonian may now explode with more angry posts and videos, because today, as we record this podcast, on September 26th, her husband, the propagandist, died after 9 months in a coma.
Помер її чоловік, пропагандист Тігран Кіасаян, який 9
May
місяців
the earth be
перебував під
glass, wool, or concrete for him. So Margarita Simonian, who appears to be suffering from cancer, will now have a little more time to spread her dark lies.
Щоб розповсюджувати свою чорнороту брехню.
Well, it's true. She said she was leaving her propaganda job, but after meeting with Patriarch Kirill, who presented her with an Orthodox order, she declared that she would continue to fight bravely, both for her health and for the Russian state.
This was another edition of Black Sky Stop Fake. Subscribe to us, follow us, and to victory together.